Hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving up my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. Last time I talked about Yu-Gi-Oh! Was with my 5Ds video where I talked about the Trilogy games for the DS, while not only talking about loving those games, also talking about the series in general. And it's also one of my best received videos of all time, which I'm still surprised by, mostly because, well, for all intents and purposes, it could have been way better. Like, the audio still needs rework, the scripting could have been better and more flow to each other, but otherwise it's fine. And I thought to myself while I was in another Yu-Gi-Oh! Binge, hey, why not talk about GX? Because I had just recently finished GX and was starting up trying to finish up Zexal, which I also have a lot of thoughts on that show too, but we could talk about it another day. But this is a game review channel. What the heck are we talking about? What game are we talking about GX? Are we gonna do another DS game? A GBA game? No, not this time, because I didn't grow up on those games. No, we're covering a trilogy of games this time as well, those games being the GX Tag Force games for the PSP. Though to say it's a trilogy is a misnomer, it's actually a hetology, yeah I had to learn that word, where the last one actually skips Zexals altogether, sorta, but not really because there's the last one that covers Arc V, which covers everything. I'm just making the point of what it's trying to do. And yes, it was all done on the PSP. Yes, that's how much of a lifespan the PSP had. It's a little insane. In any case, I owned the first game for the longest time and I played the hell out of it all the time on my PSP. And I decided to do, well, why not the other two, since, hey, they're all GX, so why not talk about the series as a whole? And yes, that includes Season 4. This would also be here where I talk about the developers, but Konami's usually very secretive on who handles these games. They're usually handled internally, and I'm sadly to report that I'm not good at research, and anything I could try to find didn't point to any particular developer group inside of Konami. So I apologize for having nothing to say here, then, well, it was handled by Konami. Though then again, this video is going to be very long since I'm going to talk about a lot of thoughts in my head. So, get your game on, and let's begin the review for Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force, the GX Trilogy. The first Tag Force game basically covers the first arc of the show, and well enough. It leaves some stuff out, but otherwise, yeah, it's just the first season. So let's talk about the first season of GX. GX is about Jaden, or Judai. For the record, I will be just referring to them by their dub names. I do this so that I don't confuse non-sub watchers, but after a certain point, I might slip up and use the original OG names, so if that happens, my apologies. Anyway, this show was technically a sequel series to the OG show, though that's a little complicated because the show doesn't really like explaining the official timeline of things. And like Arc V, from what I've heard, I've not seen it yet, my apologies, brings in the multiverse, and I'm just gonna say whatever and move on. Yeah, it is a sequel, it's just an unconnected sequel. Cause you see, after the series was over, Seto Kaiba actually began opening up duel academies to help younger duelists get better at their skills, and if they're good enough, hit the pros early, or even become a teacher to help others learn the skills. And like, a lot of people don't get this premise and think it's a little too much, and I'm like, I think it's important to mention something that some people really don't know, and I don't blame them. It's something that you don't know unless you look into it. But you see, here's the thing. Japan does not require high school. That's mostly there so that people can begin their prep work for college and get a degree. So people going to duel school to learn how to be a better duelist isn't really that hard of a concept if you also just accept the fact that this universe really likes this card game. Like, a lot. So I see it making sense for people to offer a service to help train duelists. I mean, that and besides, the world is weird anyway, so why is this too much to ask? Like, everything beforehand wasn't too much, but this is. It's all I'm just saying, it's all. But that is all beside the point. In any case, we follow the duelist Jaden Yuki, who joins Duel Academy and gets into some crazy shenanigans with his new friends, and some of those shenanigans include a Tarzan man who basically wants to perfect his draw, the stoner-ass kid that basically just melts everyone around him, a literal vampire, not even that figurative one, I mean a literal one. A random sailor who's just there because he heard about these strong cards and he wants them. Just because. Literal duel spirits. And finally, and most importantly, dueling monkey, who comes back later on. My point is, yeah, this show's weird, but that's just what makes it so fun. You gotta treat this show, or at least the first season, as a slice of life show with Yu-Gi-Oh! Trappings. As long as you do that, trust me, you'll have a good time. What also helps me enjoy this season so much is mostly that it hard sell. There is no hint of irony, no joking around, unless you're in the dub, about what's going on. It's serious 100% of the time. While sometimes they might quip about the weirdness of the situation, they're still taking the situation seriously. And I don't know about you, but I love that. I love when a show can just have these weird ideas around it and not even question it. And yes, not every episode is moving the plot along, but why should that matter? It's again a slice of life. It's about the small things that happen every so often. And yes, later on the plot will begin moving, but that's later on. Just enjoy the now, and I don't know. And like, when later on the series stuff does come in, it doesn't lose that charm of fun, that spirit of fun it has. At least not yet. We'll talk about that when we get to that, okay? And so, how do you adapt that into a game? By making it a dating sim-esque series. Like, yeah, this is still a dueling sim, but for the most part, it's also this. However, this mostly exists so that you can't tag duel immediately. Yeah, let me elaborate. You don't tag duel much in this game, or at least not yet. Which is ironically a good thing because we'll just talk about that later. Because now, it's time to talk about the decks I was using while playing these. Though while some of my choices were limited, this is also the series that began Archetypes properly. What I mean by that is, for those who don't know anything about Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm just gonna accept the idea that you know what Yu-Gi-Oh is, so we're all clear. I don't need to explain the game. I don't feel like explaining the game would help you all that much. You see, in Yu-Gi-Oh, one of the more defining things about the series is archetypes. Archetypes are basically a group of cards with a certain name in them that basically describe they belong to this archetype and they have this as their gimmick. And sure, there were some beforehand, like the Magnet Warriors and a few others that I can't remember off the top of my head. But the point being is, there's an archetype. There were some beforehand, but they were not synergetic with each other, you know what I mean? GX would begin exploring the ideas of archetypes and how they would function. Though whether or not they succeed is up to debate for some archetypes because of how they turned out. And sometimes that would require cards colloquially called anime cards. These cards only exist in the show to move the narrative and have interesting ideas around them. Otherwise, they don't exist. Though, fun fact, some of the anime cards actually exist in this game. Like, for example, the card that Chun-Li's dad used. Yeah, those are in the game, and you can use the hot sauce strategy against your opponent. And that's kinda cool, if any. Honestly, if I had knew that ahead of time, I honestly would have made a deck about that, but it is what it is. In any case, one of the archetypes they were really trying to push were the elemental heroes, and sadly, I gotta say this now, they have a real problem, and like, the basic heroes pretty much suck. And of course, I get the concept of what the elemental heroes are all about. Fusion, which would become a very big thing for this series, but we could talk about that later. See, elemental heroes fuse together to form multiple monsters, hoping to make something big enough and strong enough to handle whatever foes in front of you. However, their base monsters are entirely worthless that trying to fuse them together is literally their only viable strategy, and even then, Like, ironically enough, all the elemental heroes would get equip cards or cards attached to them to let them do more things. And ironically, even if they had those equip abilities, they still wouldn't be good. By their standards, by the way. I'm not talking like modern standard, I'm talking about the standard of that era. And sadly, I can say a lot of archetypes of this era also having a hard time to even do anything. Because again, they didn't really have a good grasp of how archetypes should work. Though ironically, they would create one of the biggest and strongest archetypes of this era during this first time, that being the Cyber Dragon archetype. And you can actually point to this archetype of where you can just say fully straight out, we're out of the OG format. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, okay, what makes the Cyber Dragon so good in general? Simple. They can be special summoned from your hand when your opponent has monsters, meaning that second turn plays had way more options to do. Meaning that they could bring out big monsters for literally no cost and do way more plays just because of that. And even without that, their boss monster Cyber End Dragon was a part of an FTK that basically made them very powerful. And ironically, as time went on, their power would get better and better with cards that just made them super busted, like Cyber Dragon Nova and Infinity. Like, those cards are super busted because they quickly learned that you can really turbo them out really hard if you know what you're doing. It's not helped like other things like Overload Fusion, which really helped some monsters in their lineup really come out really quickly. And to note, I don't even hate most of these archetypes, I'm just saying something about these archetypes that the earlier they were formed, the weirder they are and weirder to really fix. Like, to give an example, Velcroid, an archetype that I like on concept, but here's the thing, due to how they are named, it basically functionally locks them out of certain cards that would actually help their archetype. Yes, seriously, they are that weirdly made. Chaz's deck is a weird obstacle to talk about because he has 3 decks he uses together. Those being XYZ Monster, which are okay, not great, but they're just something I'm not into. Iron Dragon, which becomes a mainstay in his strategy for the most part. And finally, the Ojama, which we'll talk about later on due to something I want to talk about later. And Alexis's archetype, Cyber Angels, weren't even an archetype till way later where they actually got support that made them useful, though ironically not for their own archetype but for other archetypes to work around, which is nice. And like, to note, I don't even hate these archetypes in any particular way, I love them. It's just, you know, their ability to do stuff is very hampered by what they could actually do on their own. And that's not even to say any other archetypes were doing bad too. One of my personal favorites, Ancient Gear, would later on get support that would actually help them make their plays and make monsters that are worth playing, and showing off how to really update an archetype and make them be able to play viably. Though speaking of the characters, I just want to note here, I love all these characters, like, I love it so much. Like, I mentioned Chaz, if you need me to tell you why he's cool, there are a bunch of videos out there telling you why the Chaz is awesome. Because you gotta Chaz it up, people! Chaz it up! Chaz it up! Never give up! Chaz it up! But I will bring up his character development when I want to mention something later because it's one of my favorites. There's also Cyrus, who basically is like the little brother to Jaden. And basically his whole thing is about just growing up to be a better duelist. As the show goes on, he really does get better over time, showing off he is able to think more strategically and better off understanding how to do the things he needs to do to win. Sure, will he always win? No, but he's trying and getting better, and I think that's the important part of what this show is showing. Alexis, on the other hand, is a character that I can just point to and just say, wow, they really did not do enough with her, and it sucks. Like, to note, I don't think she's a bad character, but the potential for what she could have been and done is there, and I'm just annoyed when a character is not given anything to truly do, because I don't want another Bastion. We'll talk about him later. But I'm just getting off topic. Let's actually talk about the main plot, and that being the Shadow Rider. Which, to note, I'm not sure why they were called the Shadow Riders and not the Shadow Followers, or the Followers of Shadow, because they're actually called the 7-Star Assassins, which I get the change, but Shadow Riders doesn't make sense. But I'm just saying. And sadly, they don't come around until the end game, so what the heck are you doing until then? Honestly, it's just mostly about exploring the island and dueling everyone around you. So let's actually talk about the gameplay loop for the most. You're basically playing the classic MC, entering the school, Suna trying to befriend everyone, and all that jazz, and that's really it. Yeah, besides exploring the island and few mini events here and there, the game is mostly about dueling and raising up the friendship gauge, and that's really it. And like, sure, it's fun to an extent to see my favorite characters using 3D models to duel me and all that jazz, which, to side note, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, the North American and pretty much every other release outside of Japan took out the dubbing, for lack of a better term. Yeah, in the game, in the sub version at least, you would actually hear the characters talk a bit and do some weird funny interaction. However, for whatever reason, they took it out and didn't even bother to put back voice acting in the game. I'm not sure why, as I think they would have been okay with just the actors acting out these parts. There's not many, and they're very, for lack of a better term, ambiguous about what they're saying, other than the generic, I'm playing a monster card, trap card, all that shit. But it's still cool. Also, fun fact, this game is actually using the original official OST. Yeah, all the songs in this game are actually from the original show. While a few were created for these games, they were made for the show. Like the battle theme, the near victory theme, and a bunch of other songs in the game too. It's really good, and I really didn't know how good it was until I heard it because again, the dub really changes a lot of things including the music, which is still good, I'm just saying it's a thing that got changed. In any case, I think it's all good. Okay. There's even a few hidden characters in the game, and it's like, cool. But let me tell you, I didn't bother much because that would have been too much effort for this one playthrough. Really, the only real thing to interact with within this game is the heart system, where basically it's there for the main characters, so that you can't tag with them for the final two parts. Because yeah, let me elaborate on this. The heart system, basically, the more you interact with them, give them treats, or duel them, the more it goes up. However, let me just tell you straight up, this takes way too long to do. Like, the amount of time to just get one character up to full is just ridiculous. Like, you have to put in so much time and effort just to get one of them up to full. It's just not worth it. And once you do, you might as well just end the playthrough then because there's nothing happening in between. Like, sure, there are the mini events that just chronicle what happens in the story, but you can skip those. And if you've seen the show, you know what those events are and how more better they are handled in the show. So like, why bother? You know what I mean? And again, it's not helped that it's a grindy mess that just takes too long to get anything you really need to beat the game. And let me tell you, this becomes a running theme. So let's actually talk about tag duels for now. Tag duels are an actually officially recognized format of the game. It's just that barely no one ever tries it anymore because, actually I have no idea, I think it just might be just because of how fast the game is, so who knows? What is a tag duel? Essentially, you and your friend share a board. Sort of. You don't share a deck, but you do share just the board state in general and life points. And basically, you play against another foe to do the same thing to them. It's just basic Yu-Gi-Oh, but you have another player with you. It just seems a little weird as this game is called Tag Force, but you don't interact with it until near the end game, which is just very strange in my mind. Though then again, it's not helped with the AI. Like in my 5Ds video, I actually mentioned the AI, and how dumb it can get. I could point to so many times in the game where my opponent would do something so stupid that if they did nothing, they would win the game. Because my best guess on how the AI is working is that it's not reading the cards and understanding what they can do that will lead them to victory. It's more or less thinking of the idea of what cards can I play right now, and that's really it. That's my best guess. Because sometimes they will do the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my life. And sometimes I don't even know what their plan is at times, because more times than not, they will just do whatever and think it will work. Like, going full on attack even though they know an attack from me will win the game. Like, my guess again is their AI is to go for quick, easy wins, if possible. I'm not sure what the AI is particularly thinking, though then again that would require thinking, but you get my point. And this becomes a running theme throughout all the games. The AI is so stupid, it doesn't know what the hell it wants to do, and it's just basically throwing out whatever. And it's really not helped that their decks are not good, but they're not bad. They have ideas of what they want to do, but let me put it to you like this. You even make a semi-competent deck, you'll be fine. And speaking of decks, let's actually talk about the decks I use. The first deck I was given was a water deck. It's basically a generic water deck, but it's not good. The most powerful monster in the deck is a 24,000 beater normal monster. And let me tell you, you don't want that on the board. In fact, when I was younger, I actually tried to rework it into making it a better functioning water deck, but it's still bricky. But then again, when you have Pot of Greed, it's a lot less brickier. Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. Yeah, for some strange reason, Pot of Greed is not banned in this game. Yeah, it's only limited. I'm not sure why, but in any case, there is actually something I do want to discuss. A lot of people don't seem to get why Pot of Greed and cards like it are banned. It's really not even that hard to elaborate. The card is banned because it's too good. I mean, like, sure, we all don't know what the hell it does, but we do know one effect it does have. Draw 2 cards. And that is the effect everyone points to when anyone talks about why it's banned. The reason is because, well, consistency. In a card game, usually the one thing that's tricky about it is usually consistency, and that the randomness held makes it interesting that there is a lot of variety on how these plays can go. But essentially, Pot of Greed basically says, hey, you know that 40 card deck you have? Now it's 39, which changes the ratio of certain cards, meaning you're more likely to draw the out that you need, basically making the deck more consistent at what it needs to do. And if your deck is really good, like the Cyberstein deck, we'll talk about in a moment, it can basically mostly murder everyone in front of you. But yeah, the Cyberstein deck. Let's actually talk about it. The Cyberstein deck is basically an OTK strategy that I mentioned earlier, where you use Cyberstein to bring out Cyber and Dragon, Megamorph it, and then just plow in front of your enemy. It's a really powerful card because it basically prevents your opponent from really doing anything unless they have the out right there. But even then, you do have the backup strategy of Chimera Tech Dragon, which basically only requires the material in the graveyard, so all you need to do is dump those in the graveyard and bam bam, thank you ma'am, it's already busted. I sadly rarely used it except in duels where I just really wanted them out of the way or just to test it out, because it is that powerful if you know what you're doing. But let's go back to that water deck I used. The water beatdown deck basically works by using Daedalus as a way to cheap out all the monsters and destroy your opponent's board, basically making it way easier to beat your opponent down. There was also another water deck that I made, but it's a lot more gimmicky. I call it suboptimal. Mostly because of the idea and concept of Submarine Roy, where you basically go under your opponent and attack them directly, and using cards like Level Limit B to basically floodgate your opponent, preventing them from actually doing anything. Unless you get skill drained, then good luck. The next one was a life gain deck, which, yeah, I know, life gain in card games don't really matter, but I like the concept of it, where basically you're using it to either OTK your opponent or B-stick your opponent, by using either Saturn to deal the difference to your opponent, or Mars to make him a big beater and just plow into your foe, which I did once and it was funny. Honestly, out of all the decks, I knew this one was basically barely playable. Like, it can do some things, but it needs way more to work with. And the final one was the Gate Up strategy. Basically, stall out your opponent to a war of attrition, basically making your opponent wear out their defenses while you keep beating them up. It's an interesting strategy, but it's boring as hell at times too, where basically it's mostly waiting until you can do the thing. You know what I mean? And that was mostly all the deck strategies I used. I used one more, but I can't remember or find the footage for it. But then again, like this game, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, this game has a cool idea and cool concepts behind it, and really, if the other games worked better on it, I wouldn't really complain. However, sadly, we're gonna have to talk about how the problems become prevalent. And with that said, let's talk about Tag Force 2 in Season 3. yeah, they essentially skip over Season 2, which sucks because Season 2 for me is my personal favorite. Like, yeah, I know everyone likes Season 3, but personally to me, I just like Season 2 more. Not to even say that Season 3 is bad, not at all. I think it's well designed, well crafted. Like, sure, it has a few problems, but otherwise it's fine. Not too much. But anyway, let's talk about Season 3 for a moment, and a weird fact I learned that I'm surprised I didn't know about sooner, but whatever, let's talk about it. While looking for it, I found out something weird about this show. Apparently there was going to be a movie. Yeah, a movie. Apparently it was going to be a tag-up movie with both the OG and the GX team meeting up together to defeat the villain of the movie, that being Sartorius, who would be later on reworked into the show. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Honestly, I'm a little sad that it didn't happen, but otherwise, I get why. Movies can be a little more cumbersome to do if you're running a full series as well. Cause more times than not, they can actually mess up the scheduling of other things and mess up how a show can run. Pause, Bounds Beyond Time also messed up another show, 5Ds, and something that a lot of people actually didn't know, and I wish I commented on it, but I didn't, because you see, the villain of that movie, Paradox, is actually tied into 5D's lore with the Mech Lords, and I really should have mentioned it. I should have honestly mentioned it, and I apologize. And the knock-on effect it had on that show, and really, we could go on for days, but the point is, adding a movie can really mess up a show. But yeah, in any case, I do still find it strange that skipping Season 2 was a good idea, as it's skipping a lot of cool characters and dueling ideas that could have been used for the game, but no. And in some regard I get it, this was around the same time Season 3 was mostly wrapping up, and all that jazz, and I get it, but at the same time it's like, why waste the potential, you know what I mean? In fact, speaking of timing, how the cards were being released to the games is actually a little weird because you'd think they would just keep them to each of the individual series so they don't mess with each other. But no. In fact, fun fact, Destiny heroes are actually a part of GX Tag Force 1. I'm not sure why, but it might just be due to how they kind of talk about the release date and all that jazz. That's most likely what it is, but who knows. But also speaking of Destiny heroes, I didn't use them for this time. Sadly, I used them next time, because more times than not, I just want to focus on the things I particularly want to try out. And that meant I tried out Hasselberry's deck, Dinosaurs, plus another deck that appeared in Season 3, being the Dark World. Mostly because I grew up with the structure deck, so it was really fun to play with them. And sadly, speaking of Hasselberry, he just becomes another Misawa character. We need to talk about Misawa now. Misawa is a character who exists, but after a bit he just kinda gets shoved off screen. Not in any real sense, but more or less the plot just doesn't need him anymore, or doesn't want to do anything with him. And like, they give him some idea of what they want to do with him, but it never comes into a meaningful thing where they actually start making a joke where everyone just ignores him. And it's very strange. And I sorta get why. Mostly because his deck is very weird and nobody played with them, so they basically decided in advance, no one's going to try him, so why feature him more? Because as much as people love this show, we need to remember it's also just an ad for the game. And sometimes that just means a character will get more screen time as the series goes on because they get more and more popular, or less popular. Ironically, Misawa had the opposite effect, where basically, while everyone ignored him, the viewers began to really sympathize for him and really root for him because they're sad that this character who they might have liked at first getting sidelined way too often. And it really sucks because, you know, there's something else I haven't mentioned. Misawa actually got an updated deck later on called the Magnus Plus and Minus, which I'm so confused on why they never made an archetype. Like, it's right there, man. And mind you, sometimes this happens out of hand and just happens, and sometimes it just feels like, why are we even here, man? And sadly, this becomes a trend at times for certain characters later on. But that's another day. Though oddly enough, Misawa shouldn't even be here. By the end of Season 2, he left to go work with Dr. Schweinstein to work on dual theory and junk. So not sure why he's here, but whatever. But what even is Season 2 about? Season 2 is about, well, the Light of Destruction, or the Society of Light. We're basically run by Sartorius, who's influenced by light. Yeah, it's a thing in this universe, don't worry about it. And it's up to Jaden, with the new help of his friends and the heroes from Jupiter's moon, yeah, seriously, the Neospatians, through the power of gentle darkness, which is cool, though sadly they suck. Neospatians have a really cool concept of where basically they can fuse together though without polymerization, but after the turn they are summoned, they are forced to return to the deck. Basically meaning unless they are strong, like overpoweredly strong, they're basically worthless. And basically there are a few cards to keep them on the board, but if you need a card to keep them on the board, they're not good on their own. You know what I mean? Like, that's just a rule in and of itself. Though weirdly enough, you could say that about the entire season, where they have this cool thing, but because of a gimmick they chose for it, it basically makes them unplayable, like Sartorius's Arcana Force. They basically suck because they use a coin flip effect that at best gives you something decent, and at worst punishes you for playing them. Though I say that, they do have one of the most powerful cards in the game, that being Arcana Force, the World. Yes, and if you didn't know this, here's a real fun fact. Sartorius' actor, I can't ever say his name right, why am I keep saying Sartorius wrong? Anyway, is voiced by my lord and savior, Takehisa Koyasu, who does Dio, and let me tell you, the irony was not lost on him later on. Anyway, the World has the power to basically let you skip your opponent's turn, which is beyond busted, like no other card in the game can do this. Sorry for talking about the cards a little too much, my apologies. I just wanted to talk about them for a little bit because I have my own thoughts and feelings about them. But let's actually talk about this season and some of the things I really wish the game covered. Like, there are just a lot of duels that I just enjoy immensely, like the duel with Chaz where he basically shows off why he uses the Ojama, basically showing off that, yeah, these guys aren't good, but if you know what you're doing, you can make them pretty strong. Showing up that basically he doesn't need all these strong cards. He's so good, he can use the literal trash to win, while also using one of the better monsters. It's why I like Ojama to be his #1 monster. It basically shows off that strength where basically using the absolute worst to show off victory and supremacy to your opponent. Even though the Ojama's playstyle is nowadays lock your opponent's board. Or the Cyrus duel that basically shows off how much Cyrus has grown and evolved, showing off that now he's a better duelist, showing off all the strategies he's learned and how to move past his brother, who's actually having a negative arc at the point, and it's like really done well. And like the duel between Cyrus and Zane is also amazing. I love that duel too, even though I know Cyrus loses, that's not the point. Old Cyrus would have never won, and I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic, but you get the idea. And my personal favorite duel is the one where Sartorius fights against this guy, and he wins with 0 turns, which is just like awesome. I always love these weird win strategies, and it's like always fun to watch. Like, there is a bunch of duels here that are just, that great stuff that I love. Though that's not to say this game is covering anything bad, not at all. It is covering, to an extent, the favorite season of everyone, Season 3. Though I say that though, remember last time when I said the game was mostly nothing but grinding to the end? Well, it's about the same here. You have more events happening, but otherwise yeah, it's still just grinding until you can progress. And that sucks because card games are not meant to be grinded. Like, why? Like, I get it, you want to encourage players to play the game and duel as much as possible, but it is too much. Way too much. Like, if I didn't cheat to get all the cards in the game, this game would be unbearable. Like, the amount of duels it would take to get the heart gauge up to 1 is too many. Like, who legitimately thought this was a good idea? Because honestly, the grinding hurts the game way more, because like with every heart you get a mini event. Whatever that event is tied to the character. However, instead of becoming a nice, oh that's a little fun and cheery and all that jazz, it becomes this fucking finally thing. And then you have to wait out more till you grind up more. And that sucks. And mind you, getting a complete save file would not help. You would still need to grind really hard just to do this. And I don't get why. It's not helped that the way you can grind with the sandwiches, which I didn't mention earlier, I'm not sure why I didn't, but anyway, you use the sandwiches to basically grind out heart points. But the problem is, last time they were really cheap, so it was easy to get the sandwiches you needed. Problem is now, they're 10 times the price and duels barely give you enough to get one sandwich. If you're lucky. If I didn't cheat a bit to try to gain the golden egg sandwich, which basically brings up the heart gauge up to 1, this game would literally be impossible and I wouldn't be able to beat it before like my own personal time schedule. I say this with no hyperbole. Why are these games so grindy? Like, they are obnoxiously grindy. And mind you, that just made it harder to talk about things in the game. Meaning I don't have a lot to show you other than the duels I did. Which makes it harder to make this look interesting unless I just show off some stills. Because I'm not getting copyright strike. Fuck that shit. But anyway, let's actually talk about Season 3 and why everyone likes it. But let's go back to Season 2 for a moment. Season 2, for all intents and purposes, was still in the vibe of the original show. While there was way more seriousness, the silliness and lightheartedness of it all still exists, because now we need to talk about Jaden and something about him that we need to address. As much as Jaden's a good duelist, there's one aspect about the show that the show keeps bringing up. That he loves duels, and he loves it very much. That even when the world is at stake, if he's dueling, he's having fun. This season, for all intents and purposes, Season 3, finally breaks down Jaden and tells him to grow up, forcing him to realize the impact he has on others. Ironically, a lot of people say it just becomes a focus now, but it's always been something in the backwork of the show, but never directly mentioned, or at least not in a sense of where the story will stop for a moment and point this out to him. In fact, this season pushes a lot of the characters to their limit, and Jaden the most, as he is now having to deal with the past and how that has to affect everyone else around him. But let's quickly do a explanation of what this season is about. This season villain is Yubel. Who's Yubel? Yubel was a card that Jaden had a long time ago that after multiple points, they began hurting Jaden's friends. However, during the time when Jaden was making the Neospatians, yes, that was a thing, I'm sorry I didn't mention it. I'm just trying to wrap this up because this is really long and I don't want to really stop for a moment to talk about things in depth. Because these videos are meant to be more of an overview of something, not like a very direct analyzing of it. I'm just making a point of saying that now because why not? Anyway, after Jaden made the Neospatian and sent them up to space, he was also able to convince them to send Yubel with them so that she may learn about righteous justice through the gentle darkness of space. However, she was sent off course and led her into the light of destruction. Cause yes, everything is connected in this show. And when she returned, she was basically corrupted by it, also nearly destroyed in the return to Earth, and basically started controlling people in order to revive herself, and also to return the love she has for Jaden. A lot of people say that Yubel is the best villain of GX, and really I can't even disagree with them. Yubel has a lot of good connection and good writing about her, and making them an interesting character. Instead of revenge and all that jazz, no, they phrase it more as a love, basically a returning of that love. And it's something that kind of pops throughout the show about how we deal with these connections and all that jazz. It's a something that I'm not qualified to talk about. I'm just gonna say it exists there. That's just something I'm coming up with. But we could talk about that some other day when I get smarter. Because really, that's what makes her so interesting. It's not out of anything like petty revenge. She's just so warped by the light of destruction that she just believes that harming Jaden is showing her love to him. And I find that an interesting angle to take. Plus, the show also, in a way, tries to be sympathetic to her, at least on an overlooked sense. Like, in that sense of, yeah, we feel bad for her, but she's still, like, a problem. Anyway, one of the ways she tries to, well, harm Jaden is taking one of his new best friends, Johan or Jesse. I'm not sure why they called him Jesse in the dub. Johan's fine. Anyway, the loss of Johan really does affect Jaden, in a sense of losing someone not only because they were like someone who got you on a fundamental level, but also just because this is your fault in a way, even though everyone tells him it's not his fault. And this also causes Jaden to do a number of stupid things that lead him to his ultimate downfall. And where I gotta have to complain about something that everyone who talks about this season gets annoyed at, and I just don't get why. See, after beating Yubel and was able to escape, Jaden plans on going alone to fight Yubel and get back Johan. However, before he does that, everyone comes along and says, hey, we're going to help you, and he agrees. And everyone complains about them joining along to begin with, which I again do not get why. I also find it strange that everyone tries to blame his friends for coming along with him, even though they are trying to help. Like, this is the whole point of his collapse in shame and despair and becoming the Supreme King, an evil being that basically just wants to duel forever. To elaborate, during this time when Jaden is like trying to find Johan, he basically gets a lot more straight focused, like gung-ho to try to basically rescue Johan on his own, after learning that once they are there, anyone who duels is basically gambling their lives. And Jaden, after what happened to Johan, basically could not let that happen to the others and basically wants to go at it alone. However, this basically puts a wedge between them and actually starts creating conflict for the others. Because in his haste to fix something he started, he lost sight of his other friends, and to fix his mistake that was out of everyone's control. Jaden was acting selfishly. That is the entire point. At multiple points, his friends offer their help. In early season, Jaden would have taken it without any issue. But because of the guilt he feels, he basically feels like he has to do this on his own. And then he had to learn the hard way that no, he could not handle this alone. And why he became again the Supreme King persona. Cause dealing with what he did was too much for him. And it wasn't until watching Zane did he understand to confront himself with what he did and try to move past it. Not become that bad person again. Accepting that. Accepting what you have done and moving on. That is the entire point of the arc, and removing his friends from the equation is madness. And really? And don't say they weren't great duelists. The show at multiple points points out that they are good duelists. They're just not at the same level of Jaden. Secondly, they're his friends. Why wouldn't they want to go and help him? To remind people, they have risked their lives beforehand. This is not new to them. Because friendship is about helping your friend at great risk to yourself. And Jaden was disrespecting their friendship, which, to note, is fine because it is in his character to be reckless and charge into danger head first. But he would never willingly put his friends in harm's way, which he did. It is why the duel with Braun hurt him so much, cause while yes they were influenced by the negativity spheres, they were born out of real emotion they felt after Jaden basically abandoned them, left them in the dust, and that's why he became a monster. I'm sorry for talking about it for so long. I just hate it mostly because everyone ignores this, and by doing so you ignore the point and contingencies about it, what makes it so good. And to just side note for a moment, I also don't particularly care for the character who got him bad. Sort of. Like, Axel's fine as a character, he's quite enjoyable. He has some good duels and he's just fine, you know what I mean? It's just that I have a problem with Jim. Jim is barely a character. He's barely developed in the show, and the friendship he built with Jaden was done in a flashback in the same episode he's dueling him. I'm sorry, but when you do that, when you try to have a flashback in the literal few bits beforehand, I feel as though you're trying to cheapen out and then not really building the time and effort to show it off. Like, the show had multiple times beforehand to show this off. To note, I'm not calling him a bad character, I just find him very boring. I don't care about him, so he just becomes this thing that happens. And to side note for a moment, the second duel with the Supreme King should have been a tag duel with Cyrus, also just because, you know, he had this whole thing about being there with his bro. that he shouldn't have just given up on him so easily, and should have been the point about the entire duel? Like, be a thematical point? You know what I mean? I'm sorry for going on so much, and I just want to note, I don't even think Jim's deck is bad or anything, or like, I don't hate him again. I'm just saying it's just annoying to have some one-off character be the catalyst for story rather than, you know, a main character. Like, Jim is done after this. He doesn't come back. Though, honestly, I felt like they could have done more with the characters in general, and you know who I'm referring to, the basic gang of the group. Basically, they could have had way more to do, but they really don't. And this is where a problem begins to form up, where I just start having a problem. It's weird that Jaden gets a lot of duels to himself, where in the exclusion of everyone else, and it gets tiring because, like, I don't hate his deck, it's just that I keep seeing it all the time each week, and it just becomes tiring. But back on point, I just wish the characters had more to do and had some more point to the plot. Like, ironically Amon, where a lot of people kind of ignore him and misunderstand the value he brings to the plot, mostly to be like a sort of parallel to Jaden, where basically he's willing to actually sacrifice others for his goal, even at the cost of those he cares about, which Jaden is totally against. Even the villain Yubel is totally against these types of sacrifices, mostly because she doesn't view them as valuable, because why lose the thing you love? You know what I mean? And that's why Yubel chose him to be a sacrifice to her. Because he didn't realize the darkness in his own heart, and when he realized it, it was too late. And I find it important enough to frame it this way, because he should not just be another evil in the show. He should have his own reasons for why he's doing it. He refuses to look at himself and embrace the pain that he has and accepting it. It is why he could never, ever beat Yubel, because as much as Yubel is hurting as well, they have accepted that pain in them and the darkness that is within them. And they have a far greater darkness than Amon could ever hope for. And again, I have to really appreciate Yubel as a villain. They are a very interesting character, and you can dissect them a lot. There's a reason why, again, Season 3 is so well liked. Also, some people don't get the final part about it, where they basically fuse together, Yubel and Jaden. It's supposed to be symbolic, people. What can I say? Just accept the good and bad in you. That's all it is to it. And really, I think that ending really does make it special. And it's really hard to talk about this season in a lot of ways where I'm not just rattling on. But I overall did really enjoy this season. And I think it's worth a watch. Because it really does build up on what happened in Season 1 and 2. And Season 4... well, we can talk about that in a moment. Let's talk about the decks I was using. The first deck I was using was a Dark World deck. And yes, I was an evil. Basically, it's a weird concept that's cool, but it's a little tricky if you can't do it properly. Dark Worlds work on the idea of sending cards from your hand to the graveyard to use their ability. Problem is, they get better abilities if your opponent discards them, but problem is there's not a lot of cards that really do that, and the ones that do are banned because they're powerful. Though ironically enough, cards that send other cards to the graveyard is actually now a bad thing because of how the graveyard has become this thing where everyone uses it for resources. But you know what? Oh well. And I do need to remind people, any strategy that basically requires your opponent to do a particular thing is always a bad idea because you can't always trust your opponent to do that thing. It is fortunate enough that the Dark Worlds have abilities when they're discarded by any card effect, so at least there's that. And luckily, since Morphing Jar still wasn't banned yet, you could actually pop off some of your effects really easily. Sadly, there was no Graffa Dragon Lord, one of my favorite monsters, and Colorless, which, yes, they actually finally made a card of it a while back. And it's really cool, I'm glad they actually made it. Fun fact, by the way, Super Polymerization in the show had a weird cost to it, where basically you need to discard a card in order to fusion 2 monsters on the field. Weirdly enough, a lot of people don't know that in-universe, the reason why it requires the discard effect is actually because of how the card was made, where basically Braun was using Jaden's friends against him and using them as sacrifice for Super Polymerization, and because he didn't use Cyrus, he basically couldn't do it. It's really interesting, and I find that fun. In any case, next we have an Exodia deck. Yeah, seriously. This deck is mostly a floodgater, where basically you're preventing your opponent from doing anything until you have all pieces of Exodia, which is really easy when you have certain cards that can just let you just get him into your hand really quicker, like Tomb Table of Contents, Trade-In, and all that jazz. Plus again, the AI is really stupid. Ironically, I used this against Amon, and then I learned that Amon doesn't have a deck that uses Exodia. Very strange, though ironically enough, the Exodia support is really bad, so Mulligan. The last one I made was based on a weird choice, and I have no idea why I forgot about this. Basically, this deck is based on this one girl from the season 2 that I totally forgot and skipped over. I'm not sure why I forgot about her, until sometime while rewatching it and then remembering, oh, this deck. It's basically another water deck that's just basically low to the ground and hits your opponent really hard. That's really the deck strategy in a nutshell. It's just about frogs, man. Ironically, the frogs would get their own archetype, and technically, the frogs I'm using here are not a part of it. It's really complicated, don't worry about it. Basically, I didn't use this deck much. It's not that good. And finally, now let's talk about Season 4. The season that most dub watchers have never seen because they don't want to watch it undubbed. Weird thing about Season 4. Season 4 is actually half a season instead of the normal 52. I'm not sure why. There's actually not a real explanation as to why. Some say it's because of 5Ds coming out soon. Some say because of an actor contract. I'm unsure. I'm just telling you what I've heard. I believe the 5Ds one way more, if anything. Because you see, Season 4 is really rushed. Because when I say it's rushed, I mean as in certain ideas are just not given enough time to breathe. Like the Truman, the Darkness, whatever it is, and what's up with that. And really some finality for the characters, because as much as this is a decent finale season, it is just decent. It is really brought up by the character development and the finality of it all. Because yes, it's about time that the series came to an end. And really, only the main group of characters from the show get any sort of conclusion to them. And that's sad, because I really, again, wanted a lot more finality for all the characters, but the ones we do get are really well done. But let's talk about the final season and what it's about. See, after all the shenanigans that had been happening throughout the series, it's starting to actually come to a head where the barriers between worlds is actually being mucked up, and it's up to Jaden to speed up whatever is causing this and try to stop it. And also dealing with the fact that he spews with Yubel and how that affects him and making him wanderlust, where basically he just wants to leave. Because really, the final space between season 3 really didn't mess with the characters, and this season is trying to basically wrap them up and try to grow as characters. And I really enjoyed it. Honestly, in a lot of ways, the Darkness plotline doesn't really need to be here. Really, honestly, it existing is not bad in and of itself. It just hampers anything that's happening in the now that makes it really interesting. You know what I mean? And not to say that it's not interesting or irrelevant, it's just that, well, I just wish it wasn't there. All honesty. As much as I enjoy the duels around it, I just felt like it could have been better spent just with the characters concluding them and just seeing where they'll go next. And when it does do that, I think it handles it perfectly well, and I think it's really some of the best writing in the series. And really, that's the biggest problem with this show in a nutshell. It has a lot of great ideas, but does it always hit the mark? Sadly, no. And when ideas are explored, it's really handled really well. And Season 4 epitomizes its idea to the max. And like last time, there's really no difference between Task Force 1 and 2 and 3 all that much, other than 2 and 3 tried to be a little more different. Task Force 3, I have the least thoughts on it, because it's mostly a continuation of 2, but basically changing out some of the mechanics and making them more streamlined. Basically giving characters 4 hard events, where basically they will have an event that happens in the story, and basically concludes them. You know what I mean? Other than that, it's just the same. Still grindy, still annoying, just lesser, you know what I mean? I did forget about Destiny Draw. I didn't use it throughout the series, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why. It was introduced in Task Force 2, where basically if your life points are low enough, you control a particular card from your deck. More times than not, these cards would either be useless or I already used them, thus I'm drawing a card that's not really going to help me all that much. You know what I mean? So it's just a bear mechanic. It's interesting, but, you know. And I'm really sorry for not talking much about the games when I really do mean this. They are grindy. As much as they have interesting things around them, there's not much to talk about or comment on. They're just there. And I feel like the mini events around them were interesting enough. It's just too bad that too many of them were hidden and locked behind a grind fest that I was just not willing to do. Like, I really want you to understand this experience. They are a grinding mess that takes way too long for little benefit. It would have literally taken me months just to see enough of Tag Force 2. And fuck that. Anyway, let's talk about the decks I used and wrap up my thoughts. This time, I used Ancient Gears, which I actually grew to love over time during this time too. I was actually doing Master Duel where they were doing the special event showing off the deck that really made me like the archetype and showed off how they can support an older archetype really well, and are a good choice against decks like Tenpai. Fuck Tenpai. Anyway, they work on basically trying to summon their big monsters like Golem, Dragon, and all that jazz, which are really easy to summon if you have the tools really available. There's a lot of ways to win, plus their ability to negate back row at this time is actually really useful, rather than just a, well, that's just neat. Though speaking of support, that made me want to play another deck here too, that being Yubel. And why no one uses them. Because let's elaborate on this. Yubel as an archetype is strange because basically it requires your opponent to be an idiot or you forcing them to do something, which again makes them a bad strategy. Essentially, Yubel has the ability to not die from battle, and any damage you would have taken from her would actually go to your opponent. Problem is, you can't just ram this into your opponent, they need to ram at you. Which is a problem because that just basically makes them worthless, where basically they're just there. In fact, their deck mostly wins by using the Calculator. The Calculator is a card and monster that exists where basically it gains attack points depending on the amount of levels on the board. And since Yubel and most of her monsters are high level, they basically can deal like over 4,000 damage easily. And really, that's not a really good strategy, really. And nowadays, the Yubel has actually gotten a lot more support, where basically now they can actually do the thing of just ramming into an opponent or forcing you to actually ram it to them, which is really neat and really cool. And ironically, I wished I made also an evil hero deck, because they were also getting support soon, which is really cool. I really wish I did. I think I played one of them when I was trying to collect footage of other duels. Though to mention one more strategy that I used, I also used a Synchro deck. Because yeah, Tag Force 3 came out a little after Synchros were being introduced. And it's really interesting to play, because basically, well, I tried to copy a deck strategy from online and it's garbage. Basically, you're trying to summon Goyo Guardian, because Goyo Guardian is really good, and the reason why it's so powerful is basically it takes a monster from your opponent. Thus, you're basically getting a free monster every turn to synchro summon, and you know how it works. But weirdly enough, some of the cards in this deck don't work, and for some strange reason they added Junk Warrior, even though Junk Warrior cannot be even summoned through this deck. I'm not even kidding. But let's actually wrap this up. The Tag Force trilogy is weird. As much as I hate a lot of aspects around them, I also genuinely love it. Because it reminds me of GX. Because GX, for all the faults it had, it was overwhelming and lovable. I love it, and talking about GX is really nostalgic for me. It makes me happy. In any case, I don't know what else to say then. While I really wish the games were better, they're fine. They're enjoyable for what they are, and if you can ignore the grinding, it's fun enough. And really, that's all I really wanted. Next time we're talking about another obscure RPG in my RPG series, RPG Archive. I'll hope to see you then. See you next time.